All right, y'all, welcome to the show. So today, I got an interesting one and a weird one for you, if I'm being honest. So we have Ohio's Republican governor just put his middle finger up to like the entire far-right movement that's obsessed with being anti-trans. He vetoed a bill here, and it's I can't wait to get into the specifics with you. It's fascinating. So we'll talk about that. We also have, I warned you this would happen. There was the massive Republican Civil War where you had Marjorie Taylor Greene was defending Kevin McCarthy, but Lauren Boebert and Matt Gaetz were viciously going after Kevin McCarthy, and they blew up the caucus and had all these problems. And I warned you that this guy, Mike Johnson, who basically is like an AI-generated Republican, he's a super fundamentalist evangelical Christian. He was like their default option of like, I don't know, everybody kind of likes Mike, sure, go with him. I warned you that that was going to end rather quickly because the head of the Republican caucus has like the hardest job in the world where everybody just hates each other for petty personal grievance reasons. And I told you that they're all going to turn on him. Well, guess what? Now Marjorie Taylor Greene is going scorched earth on his ass. So we'll talk about that. I have a really interesting piece from the Washington Post, the top 10 worst things President Biden did in 2023. I'll go through every one of those for you, and I'll just tell you in advance, it's kind of stupid. Like, I'm a harsh critic of Joe Biden now, but the stuff they say he did that was bad, most of it is just like, what? So we'll talk about that. And then later on in the show, we are going to have some fun today. And the fun portion is, does Donald Trump shit himself? Is he what they call incontinent, where he can't control his bowels? The resistance liberals are cooking. They are cooking on that one, and I can't wait to give you the theory and tell you my thoughts. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it here. So Axios has this really interesting piece about Ohio's Republican governor who vetoed a ban on gender-affirming care. So there's a lot of like nuances here, so let me walk you through it. Ohio Governor Mike DeWine vetoed a bill on Friday that would have prevented minors from receiving gender-affirming health care and restricted transgender girls' ability to participate on school sports teams. DeWine is now just one of two Republican governors who have vetoed restrictions on gender-affirming care, and among a few who have rejected bills that would constrain trans athletes. Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, who last I checked was still running for president, even though he's hovering at like 0.2%. Asa Hutchinson vetoed a similar gender-affirming care bill in 2021, while Utah Governor Spencer Cox, hilarious last name, and Indiana Governor Eric Holcomb rejected bans on trans athletes last year. So this is interesting. You have this trend of Republican governors who are not really going along with the anti-trans panic brought to you by like Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh and the Daily Wire and like the right-wing onlineosphere. They're not really on board with that. The bill was sponsored by State Representative Gary Click, a Baptist pastor, and supported by religious groups and a swimmer who competed against a trans athlete in college. Opponents included various medical organizations, children's hospitals, and LGBTQ rights groups. DeWine has previously said the issue of trans sports participation should be handled by athletic associations rather than the government. So let me pause there to point out, his position is different than what you would expect. His position is, look, I'm not even necessarily in favor of these trans athletes competing against biological women, but what I will say is it shouldn't be up to me. It should be up to these, whatever the individual athletic associations decide is best for them based on their own circumstances and cases. They should be the ones to decide. So in a sense, it's actually consistent with old school conservative Republican tradition of like small government is preferable. That's what he's doing. He's taking the small government position. There are only a handful of trans athletes in Ohio that would have been impacted by the law out of approximately 400,000 athletes in 7th to 12th grade sports, according to the Ohio Capital Journal. That point really should be highlighted here, that like in many cases you have these anti-trans athlete bills that pop up in these states, and sometimes like the bill literally affects one student. One. And so they make a whole like statewide crisis over like one student who's in like 7th grade or whatever. And it's kind of mountain out of a molehill type situation. DeWine said in a press conference on Friday that before vetoing the bill, he spoke with several different people with a wide range of opinions on gender-affirming care. They included doctors who provided the care and doctors who oppose it, people who have received such care and had positive and negative experiences, and parents who believe their children were saved by gender-affirming care. DeWine said he concluded that most decisions on gender-affirming care should be made by parents informed by doctors who are advising them. Quote, "This bill would impact a very small number of Ohio's children," DeWine said, "but for those children who face gender dysphoria and for their families, the consequences of this bill could not be more profound." So in other words, he talked to all different people on all different sides of this issue and got as well-rounded an opinion as he possibly could. And his ultimate conclusion was, this is just not the business of the government. It's just not. You guys need to determine within your own families, with your own parents, with the individuals in question, you guys need to come up with the best answer you possibly can for you. Again, consistent with the old school Republican idea of small government being preferable. He's actually standing by that principle in this instance. So this is where it gets even more interesting though. Quote, "Ultimately, I believe this is about protecting human life," he added. "Many parents have told me that their child would not have survived, would be dead today if they had not received the treatment they received from one of Ohio's children's hospitals." Wow. That's a Republican admitting that in some instances, gender-affirming care for somebody with gender dysphoria is literally life-saving. I don't know if I've ever heard other Republicans make that very obvious point. DeWine said in deciding whether to veto, he only focused on the bill's limitations on gender-affirming care. He said he didn't consider the sports ban because, quote, "it affects just a handful of children." So in other words, context and perspective and scope and scale is what he looked at. And he's like, well, the more important part of this is not the sports part. The more important part of this is the gender-affirming care part. So again, this is also interesting. Though he vetoed the bill, the governor said he agreed with the state legislature on multiple points it raised. He said he agreed that gender-affirming surgeries should not be performed on minors and directed state agencies to create rules to prevent them from receiving such treatments in the states. Okay, so this part is fascinating because what his point is like, look, if you have somebody who's underaged and they go to a doctor and they talk to their parents and it's conclusive that they have gender dysphoria and they need treatment, his point is, at that young age in particular, I should not rule out basically hormones and those sorts of surgical interventions. I'm sorry, it's not surgical. Those sorts of medical interventions. But what he says is, but my position is, I don't think there should be like bottom surgery or top surgery done when they're that young, right? And so in a sense, he's kind of like, I mean, I would call him like a centrist or a moderate, but I don't even know if this is centrist or moderate. This is just like sort of in line with the medical literature on this at this point. Because I remember I went through the guidelines on trans healthcare a while ago, and basically what they say is like, they don't really do the hard surgical interventions for kids. They start at a certain age with like hormones and puberty blockers and things of that nature. But then when they get older is when they actually have the surgery. So he's saying, I have no problem with like banning the surgeries, but this bill would have been more wide reaching and it would have said no more puberty blockers or various kinds of hormones. And he said, I'm against that. I think they should be allowed to do that, but surgery should wait until later. And he says, look, I agree with them when they say they want to get rid of the surgery, but the problem is this isn't about the surgery. This also bans all sorts of medical intervention for people with gender dysphoria, and he says that's unacceptable. DeWine said he also shared concerns about a lack of data regarding the number of people who receive gender-affirming care and ordered that rules be drafted to require reporting of such data to state agencies and the legislature. Republicans can override the veto with a 3/5 majority, so a 60% majority. They hold supermajorities in both legislative chambers, and the bill passed with more than 60% support. GOP lawmakers have battled with DeWine in the past. They previously voted to override a veto limiting the governor's power to issue pandemic health orders. Ohio's bill was similar to several other bills introduced or passed in other states. The legislation is part of a nationwide effort pushed largely by Christian and conservative groups that seeks to restrict transgenders people's ability to compete in sports, access healthcare, and more. All right, so there you have it. Look, the most likely scenario, you hate to say it, but it's true. The most likely scenario is this veto is going to be overridden. But the reason why I think this is instructive is that here you have a Republican governor who took this issue seriously, studied it from every different perspective, and came to a nuanced conclusion. But the nuanced conclusion is, hey, the far right are total psychos on this. They basically think gender dysphoria is a myth and nobody should get the treatment at all, any kind of treatment, maybe until later on, but in some states they're even going further and saying even adults shouldn't be able to get treatment, right? So he's come to the conclusion these guys are wacky. These guys are out there. And credit to him for like being open-minded and studying the issue and coming to his own conclusions, because he's certainly a hell of a lot more reasonable than the people who are pushing this moral panic and this hysteria. People like Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh and all these Republican legislators who they have under their thumb. I mean, it's kind of pathetic, right? That there's this massive anti-trans push at this late date. And now he's one of a number of Republican governors who took the issue seriously and said, look, small government, this is really none of my business. Leave it up to the parents. You know, certain extreme procedures shouldn't be for kids, but this bill goes a lot further than just limiting that, and I have a problem with it. So shout out to him, but we'll see what happens moving forward. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.